Streaming now on the ABC Listen app.
This is ABC North and West with Tom Mann.
Well, the big news coming out on the weekend was the assassination attempt on the former US president and current Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump. But did you know Australia's first political assassination happened here in regional SA just over 100 years ago? Well, that's the best guess anyway. The exact details and theories are still being debated, but in 1921, at Riverton Railway Station, Socialist MP Percy Brookfield was fatally shot. His killer was Korman Tomayev, a migrant originally from Russia, but his motivation remains a mystery to this day. John Wilson is a railway historian and author. Good morning.
Good morning, Tom.
Now, John, before we get into the details of this particular incident, tell me how you became aware of this story and your research surrounding it.
I've been a member of the Australian Railway Historical Society since I was in high school. And in 1970, I did my first book, which was a softcover book for the centenary of the railway to Burra called Rails to the Burra. And in that, I had a few pages about the shooting of Brookfield. Now, in those days, you could only rely on what you got out of the South Australian Register newspaper. Now, in 2018, it was the turn of the centenary of the railway to Clare, so we did a big book called The Riesling Railway, and there's a lot of Riverton material in it, and there's a lot of Percy Brookfield. And the interesting thing is that in those 50 years, there's been a lot of new material that came to light, and I was able to do quite a long and investigative study into the shooting of Percy Brookfield.
So Percy Brookfield, I understand, was quite an interesting and somewhat controversial figure, originally from Broken Hill. What can you tell me about what you know about him and what he was known for?
Well, he was a remarkable man. He was a socialist, and he was nominated by the miners of Broken Hill to sit in the Parliament in New South Wales, but it was a Labor government and he was a socialist, and he found them to be quite shonky, and he didn't want anything to do with them. He was a man who was totally committed to the welfare of the Broken Hill miners. And I think the testimony of that is his gravestone in the cemetery is higher than anyone else, and I don't think anybody would be game to put in a taller gravestone. He was highly respected and he was entirely honourable.
Wow, that's it. Yeah, it's an incredible way to be remembered. Yeah, go on.
Now, there's been a book written about Percy Brookfield by a chap called Paul Adams, and I found that very valuable in my research. But since that research, there's been a couple of other interesting sources of information that have enabled us to put together a bit more of a picture. And one is the history room at Riverton. The council runs a history room, and it's got a lot of archival material, and there was some material in there which was absolutely amazing. There was part of his medical record from the lunatic asylum and shouldn't have been there, but they didn't know how it got there. And the other interesting thing is the Trove facility of the National Library of Australia is a wonderful resource, and it doesn't cost you anything to use, and you can go back and do searching through old newspapers. And I've done a lot of searching and come up with a lot of references, which, when you add them all together, gives you a pretty good picture of what happened.
Yeah, his life was clearly quite remarkable, as you mentioned, a few very interesting details there, but his death remains remarkable, particularly in Australian history. So what is known about what went down at the Riverton Railway Station? How did the events unfold that led to Percy Brookfield's death?
Well, the Broken Hill Express was two trains. There was a narrow gauge train that came down from Broken Hill to Tarawi, and then there was a broad gauge train which from Tarawi to Adelaide. And he left Broken Hill on the 21st of March 1921, and he arrived at Riverton in the morning on the broad gauge express, and the train stopped for refreshments because that was what the Riverton Railway Station was all about. It was the refreshment room stop. And while they were stopped there were 200 passengers approximately on board that train. And all of a sudden, Tomayev was down on the clear end of the platform, randomly shooting bullets from a revolver. Now, there's no clear indication as to why he was shooting or who he was shooting at. But Percy Brookfield had long been the hero in Broken Hill. And one of the stories in Paul Adams' book was that a man had pulled a gun on him and he'd talked him round and they'd gone and enjoyed a beer together, so that Percy Brookfield almost had this aura of indestructible, so to speak. And there was a policeman on that train, a chap called Kinsella, who was a Broken Hill policeman. Brookfield went up to him, took his gun, which Kinsella handed over, and walked out onto the platform and went straight in towards Tomiev, who was shooting and mumbling gibberish. And I think Percy Brookfield thought he could talk this guy around, but he didn't. He shot him in the abdomen. And Percy died in the Royal Adelaide Hospital later that afternoon.
Incredible. John Wilson is with me, a railway historian and author, speaking about what's believed to be Australia's first political assassination of Socialist MP Percy Brookfield. Now, John, what's known about Corman Tomiev?
Not a lot, but there's some very interesting things that we've turned up. In Broken Hill in the around about 1919, that was the year of the big strike. They were out in strike for 77 weeks. And Tomiev was out of work. He had a grievance against the union, so that may have been a possible motivating factor. But the other interesting thing we turned up is that he had no previous psychological or ideological involvement. He was a bit of a mystery man. He clearly was loopy when he was shooting. Now, in one of the newspapers, and this is one of many dozens of newspapers that I consulted, and it's the only one that refers to this, is that he had a lady that he was associated with, and she died. The shooting was a week after she died. Now, it's understandable that he would have gone loopy. Now, we wanted to find out more about this lady, and her name was Madge Cue. And the only thing we could find was that on her death certificate, the person who was responsible for her was a lady called Mary Gray. So we did a search in Trove. We discovered in another newspaper that Mary Gray had been at an address in Crystal Street, which was a house of ill repute. So we reasonably concluded that Madge Cue, who had no relatives, was a prostitute, and that Mary Gray was running the brothel. And it seems that Tomiev was the pimp who was living off the proceedings of Madge Cue. Now, she died, so that his income obviously came to an end. And my tip is she was killed. She died of peritonitis. Now, I think that the tip is that she probably had a kick in the guts, and he knew who kicked her in the guts, and that person was on the train, and he was gunning to get that person. Now, whether it was Brookfield, I don't think it was.
Yeah, John, it's a pretty incredible story, and obviously still so much still unknown, despite all the sources that you've been able to dig up and all the different threads you've been able to pull at. Are you hopeful that more info around this incident could be uncovered, or do you think you've pretty much exhausted all the available resources, and given no one would be alive now who has any information surrounding this historic event?
I don't think we're going to turn up anymore, but the other disgusting thing was the way South Australia handled this. The shooting was in South Australia, but Brookfield was from New South Wales. Now, the people in New South Wales were desperate to know what happened and what motivated Tomiev. Now, in South Australia, they'd had the disadvantage of the big strike, which put the smelters out of action for a year and a half, and it also affected the revenue from the South Australian Railways, so that South Australian government had no love for Brookfield. So they wanted to get rid of the thing as soon as possible. So the powers that be got together two doctors. One of them was Michael Downey, who was the chief psychiatrist. The other was Angus Johnson, who was a physician. Now, they signed the documents to the effect that Tomiev was insane and he was committed to the asylum for the criminally insane, so that they were denied the opportunity of ever finding out what happened. Now, there is a report from Downey, and he attributes Tomiev's psychiatric disorder to the fact that he travelled down on the train without any food. But he completely overlooks the fact that Tomiev had a pistol and 70 rounds of ammunition in his bag when he left Broken Hill. So he's obviously intent on doing something, and he had a ticket to Riverton, so that the medical report was an utter sham.
Yeah, what an incredible story. It's amazing, how much we will never know now because of some of the decisions that were made by South Australia at that time. John, really appreciate your time this morning sharing what you know about this particular incredibly historic event.
Okay, my book, The Riesling Railway, is in a lot of the libraries, so if people go to their local library and look up The Riesling Railway, if they haven't got it in that library, there'll be one in South Australia that can send it up and they can have a good read in there.
Absolutely. Yeah, plenty of details to really drill down on if they want to read that. John, thanks again for your time this morning.
Okay, thanks, Tom.
Cheers. John Wilson there, railway historian and author.